Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium on Thursday, June 23rd, 2016. Please bear with me, folks. I've been getting letters from you about all the typos and double posts and everything on Facebook. I have been having computer problems for the past few months, off and on, and it seems to go in cycles. I don't know what's the matter with it. I've got every antivirus that you can think of. And I think it's a technical problem. I think the computer's on its last legs, and just please bear with me. I don't need letters and so on calling attention to all the typos. I'm well aware of it. I try and correct them as I've been blogging, but sometimes I post and it adds new errors and scrambled letters and so on and so forth. And it's getting to the point that I'm going to have to get a new one, but I'm waiting on royalties to do that. And just please bear with me. But today's news and views is going to be very interesting because, of course, right now all eyes are on the United Kingdom, on Great Britain, because tomorrow, as you know, is the day that they are holding their referendum on the BREXIT, that is to say, the British exit from the European Union, a consummation devoutly to be wished, since the European Union is hardly a democratic institution. As most of you know, it's run by a bunch of commissioners, unelected, and a bunch of regulatory bureaucrats. It's kind of a Soviet superstate, such that only Mr. Global could dream up. But of course, we know, those of you who are familiar with the historical roots of the current EU know exactly what's going on. But anyway, there's an interesting article over at Zero Hedge. I want to read this whole thing to you. It's only 2 pages long because, of course, we saw the murder of the pro-European Union, the MP, Member of Parliament, Jo Cox. And there's been an interesting result, according to Zero Hedge, in the polling data in Great Britain after the murder. Listen to this. The title of the article is "First Brexit Poll After Jo Cox Death Reveals Stunning Result." And here's the article. This is, of course, by Zero Hedge's Tyler Durden, from just a little under a week ago. He posted this June the 18th at 2016, right around noon. Listen to the article. Quote, "Before the assassination of British Member of Parliament Jo Cox, the Leave campaign had been surging in recent polls. This was before the International Monetary Fund unleashed their own version of 'We are all doomed,' and before Ms. Cox was murdered. The sad death of pro-EU British MP Jo Cox prompted a buying spree in pounds sterling that carried on through today, as hope sprung eternal that her assassination and the efforts to politicize the actions of a madman would lead to either a delayed vote or a sympathetic pro-EU Remain vote swing. J.P. Morgan hinted before the close that this was not the case. And now, as USA Today reports, the first Cox murder poll reveals a shocking swing in Remain voters. British support for remaining in the European Union has weakened in the wake of the murder of the pro-EU politician Jo Cox, according to an online research company Friday. That would be last Friday. Curiously, a London-based company, that's spelled Qriousy. That's the actual name of the company. Curiously, a London-based company startup that gathers data and intelligence about consumers through mobile phone apps found that backing among likely voters for Britain's EU membership has dropped to 32% from 40% before her death. The poll was based on 1,992 British adults surveyed on June 13th through the 16th, and then on 1,002 on June 17th, the day after Cox was shot and killed in northern England. The startup claims to have held the first such survey on the topic since the lawmaker's slaying. Most of Curiously's surveys are done for corporate brands, and it has not previously conducted an EU referendum poll. Respondents were asked, quote, "Imagine the EU referendum were held today. Would you vote for the UK to remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union?" Unquote. They were given three options: remain in the EU, leave the EU, or don't know. Now, I'm skipping a brief paragraph here and continuing with the end of the article. With the news that the Times newspaper has come out in support of the Remain campaign, while the Sun, the Spectator, and the Telegraph all support Leave, the fact that Curiously found that 52% will vote to leave the bloc in a national referendum on June 23rd, unchanged from before the parliamentarian's death, is telling to the social divide in Britain. But the weakening support for remaining in the EU coincided with a large move toward don't know, which leaped from 16%, or pardon me, to 16% from 9% before Cox's assassination. The major British polling firms, including YouGov, were expected to release the first EU opinion surveys following Cox's murder over the weekend. In a surprisingly late release, one can only imagine in response to the poll above, the BMG Herald has released a poll which, surprise, surprise, shows a big lead for Remain. The UK phone poll on EU shows a 7-point lead for Remain over the Brexit poll. So the polls in Britain are iffy. One says the Brexit is ahead, the other says Remain is ahead. Now, I want to comment very briefly on what may be going on here. I think personally, if you recall that story about Queen Elizabeth II inviting the Vice Prime Minister to Buckingham Palace and expressing her misgivings about the European Union, which got out into the British tabloids rather quickly, you'll recall. I think what's going on here is something that the bureaucrats in Brussels better pay attention to, because support for the EU is soft all across the European Union, not just in Great Britain, but in France, in Germany, and in Italy. And I suspect it's going to grow dramatically in countries like Spain, Greece, and so on that have been under the thumb of German austerity measures basically being imposed. So now, what this means, I think, in the long term, is that regardless of the referendum vote, I think you're going to see these movements increase, and the European Union is either going to have to dramatically restructure itself and become a much more representative and democratic institution than it is right now, or you're going to see these countries leave. In the long term, as I've been arguing, I don't see that Great Britain has any real thing to gain from losing such a considerable portion of its national sovereignty to a bunch of unelected bureaucrats in the Brussels Union. So this movement, I don't think, is going to go away. I think it's going to increase, and we might expect an increase of the movement for other nations within the United Kingdom to break away from the United Kingdom. We've been seeing that in Scotland off and on for the past few years. This is going to remain, and regardless of the outcome of the vote, I think it's going to increase. Now, there's another thing to remember here. When you join the EU, it's part of the treaty obligations that if a nation decides to withdraw from the EU, it has to negotiate the terms of that withdrawal in order to smooth the transition. So in other words, even if Britain decides to leave the EU, that leaving is going to be a prolonged process. It's going to be kind of like the breakup of the old Soviet Union, only in a less dramatic fashion. So in other words, once you're in the EU, there are strings keeping you in the EU even if you want to leave. You have to negotiate that process and make sure it's not going to affect the rest of the EU. And that's the problem. It's sort of like a vote for secession. You don't really are able to secede right away. You have to go through the process of negotiating again with those unelected commissioners in Brussels on the terms of your exit, all right? So this is a prolonged thing that I think we're watching. I think it's going to lead inevitably, if the EU wants to remain the EU, it's going to have to change institutionally in a dramatic fashion. We've seen endless British critiques of the way that the Brussels commissioners run things. If you're not familiar, the rest of you that are outside of Great Britain, with the name of Nigel Farage, a British member of the European Parliament and European Commission, he has been relentless in his criticism of the institutional structure of the EU. And he and his ideas are only going to grow in Europe. So regardless of the vote, I think we're in for some bumpy times for the EU. I wouldn't personally be surprised if Britain voted to remain. I wouldn't personally be surprised if it voted to exit. These polls right now are rather soft. I'm not familiar with the most recent polls, but it's going to be an interesting vote to watch. But regardless, the consequences in the long term are the things to watch. If Cameron lives up to his pledge to renegotiate the terms of British membership in the EU, which is why he's been pressing for the Remain vote, because he can't do that if Britain decides to leave. Now, if that vote goes through for Britain to remain, Mr. Cameron's going to have to deliver on his promises. That's where the rubber will meet the road. Because if the EU balks at his proposals, that will be a clear sign to everybody that this isn't really a democratic institution at all. It's a bureaucratic institution run by the bureaucrats, for the bureaucrats, and for the bankers behind them, of course. So an important vote. Watch it carefully. We'll see what happens. Regardless of what happens, I think the EU's days as currently constructed are numbered. That's it for today's news and views. Keep your fingers crossed, folks, on the computer problems. I hope that they will sort themselves out over the next couple of months. I'm crossing my fingers for some good royalties to get a new one. Anyway, be patient with me, folks, and we'll see you on the flip side. Bye-bye.